I want to thank everyone at NYU Journalism and also Africana Studies who have co-sponsored and supported this event. It has been a cast of thousands. And for those of you here in the flesh, you know there was some delicious Jamaican food because we roll like that. And we are here for Black ethnics, and I see a lot of wonderful familiar faces. Hi, Esther. So without going into a long exposition, we'll explain as we go along what Black ethnics means. But if you want an explanation, you can go to my Twitter feed, at Farai, at F-A-R-A-I, where I just had an interesting back and forth with a gentleman who had the question, what are we talking about? But I'm gonna plunge right in. And I'm gonna start with the US Constitution, original version, where things started going wrong around Article 1, Section 2. So, Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Section 2, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined adding to the whole numbers of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed and 3/5 of all other persons. And we know who made up the majority of those all other persons who were not free. My friend, Professor Christina Greer, to my right, calls the general descendants of both free and enslaved blacks JB, or just black, or at least that's one term. But as we progress through this life of ours, we have seen an evolution of blackness and of race in America, where there are people of African descent, of course, all over the world. You know, I've met folks in Japan and even in China, and certainly in Europe, and certainly, you know, in Crown Heights, we've got a whole Caribbean diaspora. And so there's no one blackness anymore in America, but that perception is sometimes hard to change when we literally had codified in the very first laws of this country this designation around what blackness was and what the legalities of blackness were and how those interacted with the legalities of America. Not to mention, or to mention, the fact that when we began to do things like the Louisiana Purchase and the somewhat dodgy acquisition of the Southwest, we got mestizo Latinos, including Afro-Latinos in the mix as well. So my panel is Professor Christina Greer of Fordham University, author of Black Ethnics. Lonnie Isabel is someone who is now at CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, but helped Newsday win a Pulitzer Prize for its Rwanda reporting, among many other wonderful journalism exploits. And Raquel Cepeda is a multimedia journalist, documentarian, author, whose latest book, Bird of Paradise, How I Became a Latina or Latina? How I Became Latina, is an incredible story that blends biological history, narrative history, and cultural history. So I want to welcome you to a free-range conversation about the evolution of the diaspora, both in the US and in terms of ripple effects. So let me start with you, Professor Greer. So you wrote a book called Black Ethnics, from which I just stole the title. And what were you writing about?
So the book, and I'll bring a copy out so you all can actually see it. I start the preface of the book discussing my time at Tufts University in Massachusetts, where growing up, much like I'm sure some people in this room, I grew up in a pretty homogenous school system. I was the sort of one black kid in the honors classes, if you will. Not many people of color in my neighborhood. And so when I got to college, I was really excited to be with black people for the first time. in an academic setting. And so Tufts has an activity where they take black students who would like to go, which is usually a pretty significant size of the class, to Cape Cod for the weekend to just have sort of Black Students Weekend. And I was part of the largest black class at Tufts at the time, 60 students out of 1,200, which was huge, huge. They like to keep it roughly at 3.3%. So when we went on this trip, one of the facilitators, one of the moderators, asked us all to close our eyes and raise your hands if your parents told you, now that you're in college, and when you get to college, don't mess around with those black kids. I was like, what kind of question is that? So of course I opened up my eyes, and everyone's hands are raised, except for my hands and the 5 other hands of the 5 black Americans on the trip. And so that started this much larger journey about my own identity, but hanging out with, my college best friend is Nigerian American, and there were so many things that I would bring up, like, yeah, well, you know how our families are. She's like, actually, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I realized I was coming from a very black American space, and she's coming from a space where she has immigrant parents, and they conceptualize race and identity and politics in somewhat different ways than my parents did. And so when I got to graduate school, I was playing around with some data. I make surveys and do quantitative methods, and I recreated the data of a scholar named Marty Gillens, and he wrote a book called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And he didn't bother to look at any black Americans or people of color. He just looked at why white Americans hate welfare. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should recreate this data with blacks, just to see if his theories hold up. And what one usually does for the graduate students in the room is when you're replicating data, you should also throw in some other variables that are of interest to you. And so I actually threw in a parent nativity variable. And it wasn't statistically significant, but what I found was that whites whose parents were not native born, okay? So whites who are sort of children of immigrants actually believed in the welfare state. And whites whose parents were native born did not. And so when I ran that data for blacks whose parents were not native born did not believe in the welfare state, and blacks whose parents were native born did. So the data essentially crisscrossed. Now, it wasn't statistically significant, but that coupled with my journey from Tufts and sort of these conversations as I got older, as my friend base expanded, I constantly realized that the people that I'm interacting with, my black community, if you will, was much more complicated and complex, and we're not all descendants of the US South. And as I read more literature on blacks, many scholars, especially scholars of color, would refer to black populations as African American. And that's interesting, but being in New York, and knowing, growing up, it's like, I knew I had sort of Caribbean friends and African friends, but never really put it in that sort of language and context before. And so really, I was talking to someone earlier today, when you go to write a dissertation for the graduate students in the room or a master's thesis, having that sense of fear where you think, I've stumbled on something that's so obvious. Why is there no book about this? And then you start to get paranoid that maybe you haven't stumbled on something obvious, or it's a horrible thesis, or it's a horrible dissertation. And there's been some great work by CUNY sociologists especially who have looked at Afro-Caribbeans and black Americans. Fantastic work. And Ruel Rogers, who's a political scientist at Northwestern, has done some fantastic work about Brooklyn specifically and Afro-Caribbeans and black Americans. But knowing that Africans are one of the largest, fastest groups of sort of Africans from all over the continent, are sort of collectively the fastest growing group of immigrants, why are they not included in this data? And I was curious to see if some of these theories would actually hold up over time with people who don't necessarily have the same exit option, with people who aren't necessarily coming here with the same immigrant selection narrative, with people who are coming sort of as refugees or on different types of visas, or as entrepreneurs, or with a different language background. So all these other complex variables that sort of change the African narrative from Afro-Caribbeans and black Americans.
I'm going to leave us with a cliffhanger as to some of your data, and as someone whose father is from Zimbabwe and mother is from Baltimore, and whose mother's family is from Virginia and Maryland, and if you trace everybody in my family back, all you find is farmers. There are many things the same and many things different, you know, and I saw them myself growing up. But I want to get to Professor Isabel. Tell us a little bit about the seminal work you did as an editor that helped Newsday get the Pulitzer Prize, and how you reported on Africa in a way that you know, by needs had to process for Americans. And what I will say is that Raquel and I have our mobile devices. We may or may not tweet throughout this. We're not ignoring you when we tweet. So, in any case, please.
Okay. Oops. I hope I didn't do that. Well, I can say this after being in, hearing my name with professor sort of makes me feel weird. I'm a reporter. I've always been a reporter, and that's all I've ever wanted to be. I do teach journalism now, and when we decided and forced Newsday to consider covering the Rwanda story 10 years after the genocide, which most, like the US government, most of American journalism kind of pushed aside and didn't really give it the kind of emphasis that such a catastrophic event needed. And so we decided that what we wanted to do was to find out how a country could survive after such a thing, how people could, after all those differences, stay in the same land. And if you look at Rwanda now, it's surviving barely. There still are lots of conflicts and lots of ethnic problems and lots of control. But what we sought to do was to tell the personal story. And we wanted to tell the story not of the American foreign policy or lack thereof, not of why this happened so much, but who were the people that it happened to and what really happened to them. And I think that the reason that we wanted to do this is because there is always an interconnectedness to the experiences of people who are sons and daughters of Africa, which is all humanity really, but I'm talking about us. And that is neglect, that is division, that is trying to show that people can't come together and live. It's no news to say that people have gotten past differences. And so Deleo Ligeti, who won the Pulitzer Prize, I was the editor. Deleo Ligeti is a Nigerian journalist, a very dear friend, who decided to do this. And it was a very difficult thing. We opened this series with what I strongly wanted to open the series with was the issue of rape and the issue of survival of rape and the issue of why this was, why the rape as a weapon of war of black women wasn't news. And it still isn't. It's still going on all over the world. Why is that so? I think that the desire of those who practice hegemony, who practice control, who dominate the world, is about division, and it's about ignoring the things that occur to people like those in Rwanda. So it's very difficult, if you can imagine. I don't know if you know much about Nigeria or about its relationship with other countries, or about men talking to women about rape. But Dele was able to, with a lot of perseverance, to tell women's stories. And he told it in a personal way, in their house, in their neighborhoods. He also told stories of neighbors who were Hutus, who lived next to Tutsis, and the Hutus had killed some of the Tutsis' relatives. And so in doing this, we wanted to show what is hardly ever shown in journalism, which is the complexity of our lives. It is not that we're just about oppression, or that we're just about being victims, but about the attempts to build something out of the ruins of colonialism and the ruins of economics. And so it was very successful. And when the series appeared, we fought tooth and nail to get the play for it. And the newspaper, which was, most newspapers, I don't know if they do that now, but they're very aggressive about the Pulitzer Prize and applying for it. But I myself had to personally apply for it, for this piece. And it won. And Dele was the first African to ever win a Pulitzer Prize. And so that was, seems like ancient history now, but these kinds of issues still persist. There still is rape used as a weapon of war. The violence against women in Africa is unconscionable. The ignorance of us, mostly due to the fact that our leaders never talk about it. President Obama, where are you? And because our press ignores it. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Lonnie. I mean, I certainly think that that was extraordinary journalism, and rape is used as a tool of war in many countries, but it's sort of taken as like, oh, well, that's what Africans do sometimes, even though there's Bosnia, there's any number of examples dating back to the Greek and Roman days and beyond. But I think that there's this lens, and a lot of what we're talking about is how the lens affects how we can tell stories. And speaking of telling stories, I have, every time somebody comes into my office, I'm like, hey, have you seen this book, Bird of Paradise? It's really amazing. I gave away some extra copies, but I'm down to my last one, so all they can do is look at the cover. So, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need book stands. Try to prop yours up again, but you might need some help. But yeah, so this is Bird of Paradise, How I Became Latina.
Do you want to use
And
this
then-
book to prop your book up? Yeah.
Look at this.
It's one of my favorites.
And then
too.
oops. Yep, that's all right. It was bound to happen. And Black ethnics. But basically you do something really unusual in your book, which is that you tell a personal story with political ramifications using DNA testing and narrative storytelling, and so that's my description of kind of how this plays out. Tell me what we can expect from this book.
Well, Bird of Paradise, How I Became Latina is really 2 books in one. There's a part 1 that really talks about coming of age as a Dominican American, as a Dominican, which is how I identify, in Washington Heights, Inwood, in the neighborhood of Inwood, and in the backdrop of hip hop culture, and and all of a sudden seeing this massive immigration of Dominicans coming to the neighborhood, and also it's also a very personal story about how I became interested in exploring race and ethnicity, and it's really because of my father's own negation of where he came from and his desire to live this misnomer that we call the American dream, which is really the American nightmare for other people, right? Because, and one of the things that I learned during that part 1 writing of the coming of age story is how certain groups are encouraged to completely assimilate and acculturate to become quote unquote American. And as I took the unlikely route of, I thought it was very fun to when you look at a Latino American, a Dominican American, and Caribbean American, it's kind of a genetic crapshoot. You just don't know what you're gonna get. We all say, yeah, we're part African, part European, part indigenous, but really, I wanted to really get like confirmation. Spiritually, and a lot of this book has to do with spirituality because I made sure not to abandon that side of me as much, as much as I was pressured to by my parochial school and my public school teachers. And by the way, I'm somebody who's very ambivalent and kind of believes that higher education or the school system is not for everybody, especially if parents are not involved to help unlearn what you're learning, all the BS you're learning in school. That really at the bottom of the well is all about self-hate, right? So basically, I took this unlikely route of spending the next part of the book looking at what Latino Americans are by using myself as an example and going on a genetic adventure with my father, as well as several other people in my family, some of who I met through social networking I didn't even know existed. And it was really interesting, and one of the things I did find was that, since we're in an academic setting, that really the indigenous people of the Americas were just, it was genocide by academia. They still exist like other people's do in fragments. So that's one of the things I learned on the other side, on the part 2 of the book. But, when a lot of the stuff that one of the main threads is the miseducation. And it just really infuriated me to, I mix kind of hip hop lingo with academic lingo, which is, I just basically wrote the way I speak. And it really, as a mother of a 17-year-old, it really bothered me how little things changed. And how she's still being taught today that, you know, the people that came to the New World, the missionaries, were these, you know, European, God-loving people that were here to set the primitive people, the Africans and the indigenous people free, right? By teaching them all about Jesus, which we all know is BS, right? So it was really interesting. I interviewed a lot of academics, and I really learned a lot about myself. And one thing that I learned that really got me even closer, made me feel closer to the diaspora, was that, you know, to be an American is really to be a Dominican, to be for better and for worse, especially for worse these days, if you know what they're doing with Haiti. But the first, for better and for worse, European settlement in the New World, in the Americas, was in Santo Domingo. The first place that they enacted the indigenous slave trade was in Santo Domingo. The first boatloads of slaves, the first slave rebellion, was in Santo Domingo. So, you know, we've been mixing and mixing for a very long time, and we are just one example of a group of Latinos. And then I started to, you know, realize that's why so many people in America, in North America, are scared, even though we were settled and already a people hundreds of years before North America were people. You know what I mean? Except for the indigenous Americans who were here first, before illegal immigration of the European. But anyway, this was a very, you know, I wanted to tell the story in a way that was accessible, because I feel like, you know, some of these ideas get repeated over and over and over again in academia, but we're not reaching the people that we need to reach, which are the people in the streets. I believe that revolution and change and how we start to see ourselves really starts at the bottom. You know, I was on a panel, in the last couple of weeks, with, you know, Mr. Harry Belafonte and Philip Agnew from the Dream Defenders, who's doing amazing work. And, you know, one of the things that we're talking about was, you know, starting a new political party, how much Barack Obama sucks, you know, the fact that we need to coalesce and coalesce. And I felt like, you know, none of this is gonna happen until we learn how to like what we see in the mirror, until we deal with our collective identity crisis. Until we start to like what we see in the mirror, we're not gonna like who we see around us, and we're not gonna wanna coalesce into any kind of movement. And one thing that I did learn was really to you know, as chaotic as a new world was in forming, was to really love the people that found ways to survive in order for me to be here. And it made me feel much closer to people of, you know, the diaspora. Black ethnics, made me feel closer to black ethnics.
Yeah, no.
Well, I mean, I love that piece, because the larger question that I'm trying to answer is, how can these, I just basically put black ethnics in three big groups, right? Africans, Caribbeans, and black Americans, knowing that there is vast diversity within these groups. But just for speaking's sake, it's much easier that way. But the larger question of the book is, how can we build substantive coalition building, right? So we can actually get something as a group. Right, and how we can sort of work together as a group. Because initially when I started thinking about this book and writing it, and I would tell people sort of fragments of the ideas, it immediately went to, well, which group is smarter? Which group works harder, right? And this,
I think the Tiger Mom and her husband are working on that book.
I know this is live streaming, so I'm just gonna let that one go. I'm just gonna let that one go. But that's the antithesis, right? And so really telling people that's the antithesis of what this book is about, right? It's not about this oppression Olympics and sort of who has it worse. Well, I'm a refugee. Well, I'm an original slave. Well, I'm a sort of, like that's you know, it's futile in the 21st century, because when a cop shoots your son, they're not saying, are you Nigerian American, or are you second generation Jamaican, or are you Native born black? Like, the bullet's the bullet, right? And so how can we actually think politically about substantive coalition?
Let me just a quick one, and then I'll pass it back. Walter Mosley once said, he was, you know, talking about when Tiger Woods went on Oprah and said that he was Cablinasian. He was like, I don't care what Tiger calls himself. If I see a truck going around pitchforking black people into the back, I'm grabbing him and taking him in the alley. So.
You know, I was just rereading this book. It's called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which is almost like a Bible to me. And I just reread it, and I had forgotten about it for years. And I noticed how little things changed, and how these women also, different women's, from marginalized communities, Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Black Americans, Chicanas, all kind of people. We're talking about this community building. But at the end, Gloria Anzaldúa talks about, how can we really, reach outward if we don't reach inward? You know what I mean?
Well, one of the things to really keep in mind, I once had a panel discussion similar to this, where I had reporters who cover the civil rights movement talk to reporters who now cover immigration. And pretty much the issues are the same. They're powerlessness, unemployment, poor housing, police brutality, segregation, denial of rights, intimidation. So when we start thinking about the differences, we should start really looking at what actually is the experience. And the experiences are very, very similar. And I think that if you look at it that way, you'll see past those artificial things that are really put up by uninformed people and grasped by the larger culture. Why? The larger culture would not like to see unity. The larger culture does not really want people to start sharing their experiences. They don't want Dominicans and Haitians to look at their experiences and say, well, we're the same people, really, because we're suffering the same way. And it really doesn't matter whether your ancestors got off the boat in Charleston or Charlotte Amalie. It is the exact same experience. And I think if we focus on that, we'll begin to see what is the same about our experiences.
I just want to reintroduce the panel, and this is Lonnie Isabel, now a professor at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, also a reporter and editor. And right here, Professor Christina Greer, political scientist at Fordham and author of Black Ethnics. And right here, Raquel Cepeda, multimedia journalist and author of Bird of Paradise, How I Became Latina. I want to dig in a little bit more on the question of reporting, because this is an event housed at NYU's journalism department, but also with Africana Studies as a co-sponsor. So I think all of us have played roles in media. Even though you're primarily a professor, Christina, you also do New York One, you've written for Time.com, et cetera. You obviously have written for the New York Times and a zillion other places and produced your own work, and you for Newsday and other outlets. So all of us have a reporter side, usually coexisting with another side of what we do. So let's think about the context of race in reporting in America. We're talking about something where it's a rare day that this ever gets mentioned, that there is not just a black monoculture, but that there's a black many culture, a diasporic culture. How do we even begin to address this in the media?
Well, on a personal level? Or?
I mean, whatever. Any.
Well, I take any chance that I can get. Like, for example, I wrote this travel story, snapshot, remember, about the Dominican Republic, and I took most of the real estate to kind of critique Dominican Republic for its ruling class, and it's the way they think and what's going on in Haiti and all that. So I feel like, we have to just use that real estate that we get, and we get so infrequently, even more and more and more these days, as journalism and publishing world become more and more gentrified, to really, be brave and critique what's going on around us and air out our dirty laundry.
I think, going off the critique thing, I've been lucky to sort of surround myself with, I call them my media mentors, if you will, but I think the integrity piece is huge, at least for me. Being a political scientist, I don't want to be a shill for the Democratic Party. That is of no use to Black folks, it's of no use to people of color, it's of no use to the Democrats, actually. And so I think in reporting, when I'm actually talking about elections in print or on television, I actually really try and think about a holistic narrative and not make assumptions, right? I'm this way when I teach. Not all poor people are black. Not all black people are poor, right? And so being deliberate in my speech, you know, one of the greatest questions I ever received was when I adjuncted at John Jay, and a Jamaican student raised her hand. She was like, I just got here. Can you tell me why I'm supposed to be a Democrat? I mean, that's an important question. And so we make these assumptions.
He was like, Colin Powell's not.
Right, I mean, and the thing is, you know, lots of black people aren't. Lots of people of color are not, especially on local elections. And realizing what's at stake for them. And sort of being able to really think about us, not just as an ethnically diverse or a diasporically diverse group, but we are economically diverse. We have totally different interests. We're religiously diverse. But our political interests are vast, which is sort of, this book is to start a conversation, not to end a conversation. So I think that's where I'm trying to go.
Yeah. When I do like this, it's just because you have to be a bit more directional.
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, see, now we got it.
Well, having labored within the beast for about 30 years or so, meaning that I worked for so-called mainstream media and attained a fairly high level of not power, but influence. I think that too often we do not press the issue. We do not say, why is it that you're looking at it this way? Why is it that the New York Times tries to identify black men as the face of HIV? Why is it that whenever there's a story in the Washington Post about welfare, there are black kids, when in fact, if you look at welfare as it exists now, the face of welfare should be a young white kid? Why is it that we allow only crises to be covered? And why don't we try to have some sense of what normal life is like? That people go to the beach, that they go to movies, that they worry about schools, that they worry about college education for their children. And I think we have to insist and push inside that beast. But I think that the explosion of new media has made it possible for us even more to express ourselves outside of that. And I think we should take every single opportunity to try to tell stories of people that are different. Why is that important? Because, I think you said, the idea of what an American is not us, right? When I go to foreign countries, everybody thinks I'm an American. They see my passport, they say, you're an American. When I'm in the US, even though my family has probably been here since Crazy Horse, or before, I'm not really an American, and neither are all of you really considered that. And by that I mean the things that are normal about America, the things that are happy about America, the things that are not based on race, aren't really those things that we find our faces in. And so we should be very, very careful about images, about how people are presented, about the face of problem being people of color, about how immigration is presented, and we should fight. And even if you're not a reporter, you can fight by actively complaining about those acts of non-inclusion, let's put it that way, those acts of omission. And there are very, very many, and they happen every single day. And I think that we have to be much more assertive about trying to influence that. I really do.
I would push back only a little bit on the new media. I mean, I'm a huge new media fan. I started my first website in 1995. I'm a big Twitter user / abuser, and Twitter has a heavy overrepresentation of African Americans, for example. But at the same time, when you look at, there have been a number of articles recently about how the new wave of journalism startups are hiring sometimes 85% white men as staffs. And so when you talk about the ways in which money and journalism are recombining now, particularly with a lot of the tech wealth rolling downhill into the journalism world, it's still not necessarily producing a more diverse media or a more thoughtful media about diversity. So
Yes, one example of that is the way, like this.
yeah, exactly.
One good example of this is the way I've been seeing gentrification being covered recently. Like, and especially in New York Magazine, which seems to be on the heavily pro gentrification side. And I remember when Spike Lee, went on his, when was speaking at Pratt, it was immediately marginalized, pieced apart, and dismissed as rent. But then, maybe a week or two earlier, there was an article about my neighborhood in Inwood, and it was the head was, "Is gentrification all bad?" And my neighborhood is broken up into two worlds. The west side is mostly, a little bit more affluent, upper middle class, a lot of gentrifiers, a gentrifying class, where east of Broadway is made up of mostly, long-time residents, many Dominican, African, Black Americans, it's very diverse. Until now, we're seeing a lot of artists move in, et cetera. But I'm just saying what it traditionally is. And this writer was just, white male, privileged. Again, journalism to me is becoming more and more gentrified, every freaking year. And he basically didn't speak to anybody on the east side of Broadway, but he got somebody, we all have those Zimmerman-esque figures in our hoods, right? To speak on behalf, somebody who doesn't ever go to the east side, to speak on behalf of the east side, which I was I wanted to oh my God, I was so angry, just to support his thesis that gentrification is really good, and it's really written to make the bleeding heart liberals feel better about what's going on. Meanwhile, I've been Googling, I haven't been able to really find many pieces on the other side, look at the other side, or that show more balanced reporting about gentrification.
I just hate that word, by the way.
Yeah.
I hate a lot of words that we use commonly, like inner city. I mean, it's the city, come on.
Yeah.
Inner city is sort of a code word. It has flexible borders depending on where you live. And gentrification means that the gentry, people who are better, people who are professional, people who are part of the upper class are moving in. What does that say?
Well, can I just
go ahead.
add something really quickly? Added to my list of words that I hate, it's minority. That word is banned in all of my classes. I'm first of all, we're a global majority, so I don't and women of color are a global majority, so I'm a majority. So that's just to go on my rant.
Can I go on a rant too?
Right, and I
hate third world.
Oh.
Because we're first world. I know especially as a
the
Dominican,
band was
first
good,
world.
right? But
Well, and so the thing is, in teaching race and ethnic politics, we talk about words like rant, words like thug, when women are just, we're histrionic and we're hysterical and emotional.
Preachy, prickly.
That's neither here nor there. So but going back to Raquel's point, I will say, so when I was in graduate school, since there are lots of graduate students here, I had a file called "The New York Times is Racist," and I would just get articles and put them in this file. And one day I always swore that I would do something, and I'd write this huge expose about, New York Times, you're talking about housing prices, but you're interviewing homeless Black people. It was just egregious stuff. But as I got older and I started actually talking to the New York Times as a scholar, I realized that many journalists have good intentions. And they're also on a deadline, but they don't necessarily know my world. And so giving them that extra 5 to 10 minutes to say, actually, I fundamentally disagree with the premise of your story, and here's why. And essentially, I don't need my name in the paper, but I love reading a story where I'm I did that. The story you came to me with was bogus as far as I'm concerned. But I gave you a little more time, and sort of I think that's the responsibility for those of us who actually speak to journalists. It's maybe you'll disagree with me and you won't call me back. That's on you, and that's definitely happened. But I find more often than not, journalists want to tell a better story, but they're just so gentrification's good, huh? Everyone loves it. It's well, let's actually slow this analysis down just a bit. And I find that that's been helpful at times. It's a slow-going process, but I think collectively, if we're doing this more, and we're invested in sort of being a part of this larger narrative in mainstream media, people are reading it. People will read the New York Times and not necessarily a small blog or my Twitter account that I have. So I think I can make that impact in that way.
Let me just chime in on gentrification and then touch on a couple of points. I mean, I actually gave a talk at one of the TEDx's that was about my perspective on gentrification, having mainly lived in Manhattan as an adult, and then moving. Whoever's alarm that is, don't be embarrassed, just turn it off. Thank you. Anyway, I gave a talk on my perspective on gentrification as someone who'd mainly lived in Manhattan in mostly white neighborhoods, and then moved to Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and was originally from Baltimore, was and am originally from Baltimore, Maryland. And I think that what we call gentrification can be many different things. I am not in favor of pushing people out of neighborhoods, of disrespecting people, which is what I mean, like, I love my neighborhood. I love Crown Heights because I know who all the elderly people in my building are. People stop and talk to them, inquire about their health, worry about them when they're in the hospital, cherish them when they're in the building. You see who has new babies. You have conversations. To me, that is civilization. But what passes for civilization in the typical world of gentrification is a transactional world where you have a key or a doorman, you go in and you go into your cubicle, which might be a 2-bedroom cubicle or a 10-bedroom cubicle or a studio-sized cubicle, and you lock yourself in and you ignore the rest of the world. I don't want to live like that. I want to live in civilization, which to me means an exchange with other people. And I think that the civilization of what are seen as gentrifying neighborhoods is not acknowledged, this deep civilization. But coming from Baltimore, which also has civilization, over a several-year period, I saw my mom's neighborhood decline. It was all owners, and then someone bought the house next to hers as a rental property. It was flipped and eventually became a unlicensed group home. And then when I helped get that shut down, it was taken over by squatters and burned to the ground, except not completely. So then I had to get on the city to remove the burnt property. And after all that, I can say money coming into a neighborhood is not a bad thing. How it comes into a neighborhood and the respect with which it comes into a neighborhood is crucial. Because if there's no money coming into a neighborhood and you have a shrinking population base like Baltimore, you have a whole different set of problems. But what I will say is that the neighborhood had civilization. And so the neighborhood association successfully lobbied for a major commercial redevelopment. And the biggest supermarket in Baltimore should open this summer in my mom's neighborhood, 2 blocks from her house. And she's like, I'm going to get a little cart, just like I had when we lived in Manhattan when you were a little kid. And I'm going to walk to the grocery store with my cart instead of her having to get in the car and drive into the suburbs for groceries. You know, so I think that what we need to do is also understand that, as you hinted and all of us have, race and class are nuanced things. You know, it's not, you know, there's plenty of rich black people as well as, you know, not as many as poor black people, but overall what we saw during the Great Recession, and then I will rant off and you guys can continue, is we saw during this Great Recession around, 2008, we saw the wealth differential between whites and blacks go from 10x, meaning the average white family had 10 times as much wealth as the average black family, to 22x. 10x to 22x. So who's going to buy that brownstone? The Latino wealth gap grew to 15x. So what we're talking about, and unfortunately I can't recall, Asian American families tend to have high net worth, but also more people working per household. So it's an interesting, mix of factors. But in any case, what we have seen is a real decimation of the tiny bit of remaining wealth in black and Latino communities, and that has led to, things like Crown Heights being up for sale. But it's complicated because I also don't want to see Crown Heights be Baltimore. I don't want to see burnt buildings. I don't want to see abandoned places. So what we need to do is have a richer conversation about race, class, money, gender, all that. Anyway, not telling you anything you don't already know.
And actually introduce a third class to the whole gentrification debate, which are people that grew up in the hood, got educated, and came back. And that goes back to the way we learn in school. Some of the people that I grew up with and came back, where light contacts have changed and given themselves American names and don't make eye contact. Some of them want to live. It's like we're like a class within a class within a class. And I feel like we're in a good position to actually start maybe the conversation or be the bridge between the gentry and the gentrified class. But sometimes I, you know, I resent the people that, you know, like the local community, because I'm like, well, why aren't you fighting more? Why are you just accepting this? Like in my community, a lot of the Dominicans are moving to the outer boroughs. And I'm like, well, you know, people have to survive. They have to get adjusted. They have to take on extra jobs. They have to take on, they're too busy to bicker on Facebook, on the Facebook community, Inwood community page about, you know, about the local flea market. Where, by the way, if it happens on the west side, it's framed as being a chic kind of neighborhood, kind of flea market. And when it's on the east side, it's like a bed bug ridden menace to society, which you know, right?
You raised a couple of points I wanted to get back to. Okay, which was this whole idea that new media is resegregating. One of the things that is pretty clear is that the decline of what was mainstream media wasn't just due to digitalization. It was due to the fact that it did not recognize the changing demographics in a city like New York, and where people started appealing to the same audience that it appealed to, when in fact the demographics had changed tremendously. And so the real growth in media has been in so-called ethnic media. And ethnic media is a very powerful force that we should support. It's not perfect, but it reminds me of before segregation, probably before I was really born, but I study history, when black media, black press, was really an important factor, where you didn't have to go to the New York Times to really understand the complexities of things we're talking about, like how neighborhoods are changing and why they should change and what policies are being done to change them, where really you could get a full and accurate picture of the politics and what the politicians really thought about race and about wealth and all kinds of things. And I think that we're resegregating, but we're also expanding a bit, and I would want you to support those organizations, support them by buying them, by complaining about them if you need to, and because I think they're a very, very important part of sort of saving what's important, which is image. So image becomes a factor in deciding what angle a story takes. How do you look at an issue? A lot of the reporters, you're right, they are uneducated, they don't have bad intent, but they have bad thoughts. And their thoughts are weighted in white supremacy. And they're weighted in the sense that people of color are problems, that people of color don't contribute, that people of color commit the crimes. And I've gone to maybe 50 prisons in the United States. I want to tell you there are a whole lot of white people in those prisons. But if you look at the United States coverage of prisons, you would think that only young black men are in prison. That's just not true. So I think that two things. The resegregation of media is going to happen because the funds go to people who propagate, you know, the party line. We have to develop our own media more, and we have to support it.
Let me
Okay.
just quickly jump in, and I'll pass to you. But first of all, I want to give a shout out to your colleague Gary Pierre, who started the Haitian Times, which is exactly one of the ethnic news outlets you're talking about. And whenever, whose alarm is that? Stop. I shouldn't really say that on the live stream. But I'm going to follow up on this idea of bad thoughts and the framing of journalism as, you know, essentially objective. But please go ahead first.
I couldn't agree more, and I came to that realization, as I started to talk to journalists, you know, not just from, you know, the big five, but really talking to more journalists from smaller media outlets. But then I also realized that in my household, my husband and I, you know, we get the New York Times, we get the New Yorker, we're sort of, now this is egregious.
If you don't mind, you can step into the restroom for a second and fix your phone. Thank you.
So what was I saying? Okay, so we get the New York Times and the New Yorker, but I realized, I would be the first person ranting if Jet and Ebony went under. And so I decided to get Jet and Ebony. And the interesting thing is to have people come to my home and essentially, see my Jet and my Ebony, in my bathroom or in my living room and say like, oh, is this 1967? It's like, no, it's not 1967, but we actually have to support these institutions. And I think as a writer, and I'm just now sort of getting the confidence to call myself a writer, not just a professor, but I think reading those types of outlets also helps me remember who I'm writing for. So taking out the 75 pages of regression analyses and my ordered probit analyses that talk about why I disaggregated this particular variable and my factor scores and my chi-squares, that came out because I didn't want someone to pick this book up and scroll through and see all of that and just say, well, I have no idea what she's talking about, and put the book down. And so I think supporting this, not just financially, but also keeping us, because we are these dynamic, complex people and going to and from our various communities, getting more education, but still having this or wanting to have this grounded connection is really important. And I mean, I'm telling you, I read Ebony cover to cover, and Jet takes 30 minutes to read cover to cover. It's fantastic. But
Just remember, Ebony is for the living room, Jet is for the bathroom.
Right. But the thing is, I will give them credit. I do think that they're both getting a lot more diasporic. There are a lot more stories about Africa and the Caribbean and celebrating people from Africa and the Caribbean. And so I actually learned something as well in a very short piece, and you move on. But I think that's really important for all of us as we try and write for all of these communities.
Well, I don't have to say that I don't feel the same way about the coverage in my Latino community. I don't feel like supporting everything that's out there because I see a lot of the same ruling class Stockholm syndrome for our oppressor, for our colonizer being propagated in the pages. And I think it's very dangerous for young Latina women and men to see those images propagated issue after issue after issue. I think we have so much work to do that sure. I would rather read a Jet and an Ebony and an Essence, who I used to write for, than some unnamed, Latino publications that I only see one face, one story, and and I actually even while I was making my film Bling, A Planet Rock, about hip hop's obsession with diamonds, American hip hop's obsession with diamonds, and how that intersected itself into the war in Sierra Leone. I was working for one of these, but I wouldn't have them. I didn't want them to put my name on the cover. I mean, in the masthead, and I was trying to become the change I wanted to see. And every single issue, I remember having these conversations with the blacks or the darks or the even amongst our own community, the Cubans, we have to have Mexican stories because they're the ones who buy because there's more Mexicans than anything. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. It was just it's almost pushing a conservative agenda, which brings me also to what I see on television, the coverage, the public intellectuals that are Latino are always most of the time, with the exception of during the voting time, during the election season, they're always conservative. They always pick if you will, a Zimmerman-esque type of figure to represent the whole community. And that doesn't do anything to coalesce us into a unified group.
Not to mention, and I do want to get to this question of intent, but I really, this is one of those rant-on moments. There's a problem right now in journalism that I discuss with a lot of journalists of color in particular, which I call the Touré versus Piers Morgan problem, which is that if you're willing to scream at a white person, you're much more likely to get on TV. And that to me is problematic because I like conversations more than screaming, by a factor of about 1 billion. But, if you're a good screamer, you're gonna get more airtime on the cable networks than if you're someone who brings thoughtful analysis. And so it's a real problem. But I wanted to get back to something you said, Lonnie, about, essentially, people who have bad thoughts in journalism and stemming from racism. I think that I love the Avenue Q song, We're All a Little Bit Racist. Some of us are a lot racist, and I've interviewed Aryan Nation, Klans people. I once interviewed Klans people in a parking lot during a blizzard, which was very surreal, but very apropos somehow. I think that all of us come from someplace. Some of us come from better emotional, mental places than others in terms of equality. But the biggest initial problem I had going into journalism, having a mother who had done an analysis of the coverage of Marcus Garvey in American newspapers as her master's thesis, and talked about the ways in which Garvey was manipulated as a media figure, and having gone into journalism with that background, as well as being someone who loved, punk and goth music and had all these different facets to me, was that people expected me to be something, to be that black girl. And I did end up being that black girl for a while because nobody else was taking the title, and I filled the void. But also, it's like, why was I always expected to write about black people from the objective perspective of white people? I mean, I was sent to Harlem to get quotes, but then my analysis was discounted because I wasn't objective. And I was like, I'm the copy boy during the LA riots all over again. It's like, you need me to go and get you material that you don't want to get yourself, but you're not willing to give me the platform in order to say what I need to say. And it really, that was the crucible in which my career was forged at Newsweek. And since then, I just don't believe in, and this is controversial, I don't believe in objective journalism, but I believe in fair journalism. So I can interview a Klans person, and I'm not going to be super objective about them, but I'm going to be fair. I'm not going to demonize them. I'm going to try to understand where they're coming from. I'm going to try to understand their social and economic history. When I was in this parking lot in Frederick, Maryland, it's a part of Maryland where, in Maryland has many different groups of the Klan. And I deliberately chose one that was nonviolent, at least to my knowledge, because I did not want to get killed like some other people have been by some other, like the Klans are kind of like franchisees, It's like some of them are like dirtier than others, let's put it that way. It's like, so I went to the clean Klan and to get my quotes without getting knocked upside the head or drug off someplace. And I wanted to acknowledge that they were nonviolent, and they saw it as their mission to preach race separation, and they weren't like hoping for the RAHOWA, the racial holy war, but they were hoping for like just a nice like all-white suburb. They were very they had very modest ambitions for their Klan. They were just like, we just want to live someplace nice without any of y'all Negroes, and it's like, well, that's great. Buy some property. It's like, well, why weren't they buying that property? Because they were poor. And I was like, oh, okay, so you're poor and you want to live where you want to live, but you don't have the money to. You got a lot in common with people in my family. We should talk, But, it's like you just have to have that empathy, the reporter's empathy. But what you can't pretend is that you don't come from someplace. So I'm lucky to know where I come from. I know the wars in which my Zimbabwean side fought, and I know the wars in which my American side fought. My middle name, Ndu, is for a woman who was an archer in an intertribal war in Zimbabwe that predated the war against the British. And am I happy that there was an intertribal war? No, because I believe like they would have been ready for the British if they'd only not been fighting amongst themselves. But that's a whole other story. I'm very lucky on both sides to know a lot about my history, but knowing that does not make me feel superior. It makes me feel empathy for every other person who comes from a culture where there has been war and deprivation, which is pretty much every culture in the world, And so I think we have to begin to see ourselves globally, and that's part of why we're assembled.
That's correct. And I'll take it a little step further. I do not believe that objectivity exists anywhere outside of maybe physics. Maybe not there either. But I think that objectivity is this sort of canard to try to reel in people who might have other perspectives. So the reporters who write those stories about welfare and they interview a welfare mother who's a black woman only, those people are being objective. But if you're trying to do something different, then you're not. For a long time in American journalism, African Americans weren't allowed to cover Africa because news editors thought that African Americans could not possibly be objective about Africa. Long time. And so I sent an African to Africa to cover Africa. I think that those kinds of things are elements of control. And fairness is what we're talking about. And American journalism has seldom been fair when it comes to race, ethnicity, and issues of poverty. It's seldom been fair. And I think that those are the things that's what I meant by bad thoughts. If you come into it without a fair perspective, if you come in it with an idea that somehow you're gonna go in and cover these things, but really everybody knows that, you know, who the real criminals are, everybody knows who the bad people are. And then it shows in your copy, it shows in your selection of stories, it shows in the photographs you use, and it sort of reeks of non-objectivity. So I don't say that anybody is. I think that everyone has an experience, everybody has, as Amir Baraka said, their own history of defeats and submissions. Everybody has a perspective, everybody has a family, everybody has empathy, and I think that we should just go with that. You know, I think that's really important to do.
I mean, that would be great if we can go with that in a perfect world, but I think that journalists of color are held to different standards.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that I want to get a couple questions in. We're probably going to wrap up we are going to wrap up. We're not probably going to wrap up in 15 minutes. But if you have brief questions, brief statements, or any thoughts before we go to questions?
Well, I just wanted to respond to Lonnie's point, just because.
And if you have questions, can you line up over here? Because we're going to just bring you up.
I might say that not everybody knows that these stories are false, right? I mean, that these images are incorrect. I think that, you know, sometimes when people see prisons that are pictures of prisons that are just black men, or pictures of welfare recipients that are just black women and black children, that goes with this narrative that they've always been taught. So I think that holds us to an unfair double standard, but we're accustomed to that, right? So, I mean, yes, we have to work harder to change those images and to change the narrative. But I think the piece that we assume that people know that these are wrong and they're sort of secretly disgusted, I think the sad thing is a lot of people don't know.
That's because I think, just to wrap it up, we're miseducated from the time we enter the school system. I think it's all interconnected.
So can you bring the questioners up so that they can be on the live stream? So if you can walk up with the mic and then, yeah. So come onto the side, come onto the stage for a sec.
Up here?
Yeah.
So
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jamiles Larte, and I'm a first-year master's student in Africana Studies and Journalism, along with two other people here. And so this panel has been kind of surreal for me, because this is a lot of the conversations that just happen in my head all of the time. And I think a lot of what was touched on were some of the contradictions that are inherent to the space, negotiating the space between journalism and between sort of cultural consciousness, or whatever you want to sort of expand that out to be. So I don't have a specific question. I guess my idea, what I wanted to pose to the panel was, how do you negotiate that space? So I think like the idea of objectivity is like a huge one, and I think, you know, once you get into different areas of cultural studies, you start seeing the problematics with that. So I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think one thing I will just say briefly is one of the ways I've negotiated the space of kind of race and reporting and culture is by evolving myself. You know, I started out, you know, with parents and an extended family that taught me quite a lot about race and culture and diasporic culture, since we were part of the diaspora. Like, I have half Russian cousins on my African side. Like, we can go all the way around the world. And on my American side, there's some Asians and some Latinos. We are the world, you know. So I was coming from a certain place, which, like I said, is not the only place or an objective place. My place is not objective just because it's mine and because I think it's, you know, pretty cool. But I've evolved. I've worked for myself. I've worked as a hybrid for myself and big media companies. I've worked for small media companies. I've worked for startups. And I think the journalist part of me is like, where can I do good work? And how can I do good work? Which is why, and I will reveal, you were in my radio class today, when somebody asked, like, what's a radio story? I was like, any story can be a radio story if you can tell it. You know, I mean, it's partly based on your skills, it's partly based on your financial resources, whether in-house or out-of-house. So just keep evolving, and, you know, and you'll find your North Star.
You know, I just wanted to add to that. As you were talking, I was remembering I had a screening at NYU in Ghana of a film called Bling a Planet Rock that I had directed and produced and conceived. And I remember that the people that were like American of the diaspora were very angry because I showed images that were difficult, like for example, amputated arms. And the people from the community were actually very grateful because they were like, well, we don't owe it. We also, you know, can't be afraid to air out our own dirty laundry and be critical of the communities that we love. And these are people from Ghana. And it was interesting because one of them said, you know, I'm tired. He like got up and after the screening and said, I'm tired of seeing, you know, images of Africa being like, you know, safari and Mandela, you know, waving docilely to a crowd of adoring people and forgiveness and truth and reconciliation. Some of the stuff is really ugly. Some of it is bloody. Some of it is horrible. Some of it, you know, in order for us to get to a place of reconciliation, we have to face the truth. So for me, I just approach it where, you know, like I'm not afraid of getting somebody angry. For example, in my book, you know, it's one of the main threads is a very dysfunctional relationship I have with my father, who denied his Dominicanness through most of my life, and which in turn made me love my community and really the diaspora. So sometimes, you know, you have to, you know, to get to that place, you have to tell an ugly truth, and you can't be afraid, I don't think, to do that either. You can't be afraid of offending, you know, your own community.
Well, I think also as a journalist, you know, the strong sense of self is mandatory, because you really can't understand other communities, obviously, unless you don't have that sort of anchor already. And I mean, I definitely, this book, I told people I wrote in my head for years before I actually had the courage to put it on the paper. And I think, you know, for me, the written word is so powerful, and I think it takes a lot of courage to actually write something down. And so as you go on this intellectual journey, I would always remember that you have to be anchored and look within, but also you have to really have a sense of understanding of other communities, but also be willing to learn about other communities. So even though I'm Black American, I mean, one of the best pieces of advice one of my college advisors, who was a Jewish man, gave me, and he said, you know, I did research in Boston and Baltimore. And I was like, oh, I love Baltimore, I know Baltimore. And he's like, but you're not from Baltimore. And so just because you're Black and you love Baltimore, you've been there hanging out a whole bunch of times, he's like, you're actually different. And so really understanding how we can go in these spaces where we may feel comfortable, but how people perceive us, I was doing a series of interviews, how people perceive us isn't necessarily how we perceive ourselves in their space. And I think that was really helpful for me to see my placement not just in the American South or in a Black American context, but in a larger Black diaspora context as well.
So next question, and you can just step in, you know, kind of more in front, probably easier for the camera. So.
Hi, my name is Manolia Charlton. I have the privilege of being one of the very few journalists who've worked solely just in small Haitian newspaper. I was the editor of the Haitian Times and the Boston Haitian Reporter. And of course, as you know, Haiti is now known throughout the world for being the place that the earthquake happened, right? And I want to talk to you guys a little bit about, or ask you a question about representations within smaller media outlets versus the larger mainstream. You rose a point about a lot of Latino publications and them not being representative of the communities that they are from. This challenge occurs for many different reasons, but one of them we haven't talked about is the economic reason, right? So how can journalists of color who are functioning in communities that they're from, how can they have much more viable careers that is both sort of economic and have a political, you know, impact? But then how can we challenge some of the status quo that exists in our own communities around our storytelling?
Well, I have a very simple, quick. I would be, okay, sorry. I would be a commercial failure if I had to rely on the Dominican press. And I would probably not even want to be a journalist or a cultural media producer, because while, you know, a lot of children of immigrants have a love-hate relationship with where they come from, I'm usually mostly on the hate side because of the policies of the ruling class. And when I go there, I'm very inspired because I see a Blacktitude movement and a pro-Haitian movement, and and I just see a lot of like really beautiful things happening in the country. But the ruling classes who pays the bills, they own the the media outlets, and it doesn't work the way it works here. And even the Dominican press here, I see is we have a very strong connection still with our with the old country. So they're also run by the elites. And then on top of that, being a woman, you have to deal with the machismo and all that BS. So the way I do it is I don't write for like really Latino newspapers or media outlets.
I would say that a journalist has many audiences. You should know your audience for your story. And if you were writing a story for the op-ed pages of the New York Times, it would be much different from writing for another audience. But the issue of economic sustainability is something that all of journalism is struggling with, even the New York Times. And I think that that is something that is somewhat cyclical. It involves the economy now. It involves attitudes about media. So I think we're weathering a storm. But I think that we should insist on writing and reporting for as many audiences as we possibly can. I like the idea that you had your film in Africa. Why don't we write for African publications? Why don't we write about the Haitian community for other press that's outside the Haitian community? So I think that we have to really scramble for different audiences now to survive.
I would also say that I personally have run a journalism nonprofit, Pop and Politics, which is no longer anything right now but a legal entity, and I found it to be a huge pain in the butt. But if you are not like me, there is a lot of grant money out there to supplement, if you like, filling out long random questionnaires and writing essays, pumping yourself and your colleagues up and making you sound like God, and then bending over to reach the dollars that have been thrown at you. But I'm not bitter, no.
I don't like the bending over part.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that grant funding does a lot of wonderful things, but I have found that inevitably, every grant that I've gotten besides the micro grants has been stuffed with provisions about other things people want done that I had no business doing. Like, can you do this study for me? We don't do studies, we produce journalism, but we're not gonna give you the money unless you do this study. It's like, great, so that's helping me how? And I would say there's a lot of grant money out there, and if you know how to negotiate to get the right deal for executing the mission you want, get out there. And also something I would say that's a lesson, I'm working on a book about the future of work in America called The Right Work. And one of the things that has come out is that in a socially networked job market, Black Americans have lost ground. Because if you think about it, more people with power in the job market, the power to employ, let's say, tend to be white. And if you are someone who says that, oh, my LinkedIn profile, it should just be all my friends. Like, I personally have a very diverse friend set, and I always have. And that was something that I got from my mom and my grandmother. But a lot of times, people, white, Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, have mainly clusters of contacts in their own ethnicity. You've just got to stop that. Even if you do it socially, what you do socially is great. But what you do job-wise, you better network with everybody, and often. So that's something else I would say for your own personal career, but I think that for smaller media, I think grant funding is a good option if you know how to negotiate back against some of the really crazy provisions. And because of time, I'm gonna have to take the last two questions back to back, and then we'll do our best to answer round robin. So when you're done, come up here, Esther, and give us a brief question if you can, and then pass it to the lady there, and we'll wrap it up.
Okay, so good evening. My name's Esther Armah. I'm a multimedia journalist. I'm diasporic, so I'm Black British, I'm Ghanaian, and I work in New York. And so I wanted to ask a couple of questions and just make one very, very quick point before I asked it. And so that first of all, as somebody, I was an ex-BBC journalist who does both independent journalism and mainstream journalism in New York. So I just wanted to make a quick point about objectivity and this idea of good intention, that is that journalists have good intention, but they don't necessarily know. And so I just say, as somebody who has worked both spaces on 3 continents, that good intention is code word for the kind of laziness that would not be excused and is not excused for people of color. And it is allowed by people of color who buy those publications because of the authority that they represent. Just as also somebody who's Ghanaian, that objectivity becomes privileging one perspective over another. So somebody who can go to Ghana and know that the local media is the most powerful, that I will watch my own perspective be privileged just because I'm BBC. But I don't know more than you do. I'm not as smart as you are. I haven't done the work that you've done. So I wanted to just say that part of objectivity has become about a privileging of perspective. What I wanted to ask you all, though, specifically was about how you negotiate your personal ambition when it collides with the integrity of a story and a publication that you actually really want to write for. That was the question. And the last 2 very quick things was one, just as somebody who... Okay. Just as a Ghanaian, I just beg African Americans to not say Africa. Choose a country and identify it. You know what I mean? New Orleans is not New York. It matters. It really matters. And just with your Pulitzer, I think it's really important to remember that sometimes what we do is we privilege different types of blackness. And I wrote about this article called International Blackness versus Homegrown Negroes. And what we do is, it is not a negation of the importance of Rwanda. I'm just saying that had a piece been written about the numbers of black girls being raped in Brooklyn or Compton or Detroit or Los Angeles, not only would there not be a Pulitzer, it wouldn't be a story that anybody would want to print. And I think some of the ways in which we privilege our own blackness matters.
Thanks, Esther. So the question is basically navigating your own ambition when you want to, for example, work for an outlet that may not have the best interests of the world at heart. But I want to get this last question in, and then we'll do our best to address both.
Thank you. My name is Helena Solomon. I'm a prospective graduate student hoping to study journalism here in New York City. So my question, I'm always concerned about getting to the root of the problem. And it's been mentioned here that the miseducation of our young people and ourselves at one point leads to this problem. And so I'm wondering, because journalism, I think, is often thought of as an adult medium, what is journalism's responsibility and what is our responsibility as journalists, aspiring journalists, et cetera, to young people? How do we appeal? How do we make the change where it's probably the most effective?
Okay, let me just repeat the questions. Helena just said, what is the responsibility of journalism to young people? And Esther Arma was asking about how do you act with integrity on a personal level while pursuing bigger outlets or potentially big game in the journalism world.
Well, I know I'm trying to think of an outlet that I've always wanted to contribute to. And I can't think of one that I've always really wanted to contribute to. But the latest one that I've been contributing to, the New York Times, obviously they write a lot of things that I don't agree with, and that's fine. We all are entitled to our own opinions. But what I do get away with is my point of view. And I've had people come up to me. I've gone to meetings at HBO or somewhere, and then an assistant would say, "Excuse me, my boyfriend writes for the New York Times, and we don't understand how you were able to get away with what you said, with the kind of way you speak, the kind of way you write. Like, how does that happen?" And I get that over and over and over and over again. So that's basically how I negotiate. It's like, if you want to, at this point in my career, if you want to hire me to do something, you're going to have to accept my voice the way it is. And the other question was, oh,
How do you make journalism something that youth can learn from?
Well, by telling the truth as best as you can, but also in my own grassroots kind of way. I try to volunteer, speak for free at my local high schools and grammar schools that would have me, because a lot of times I get disinvited before I'm able to reach the classroom. And then so what I do is I grab my daughter's friends and I talk to them. But no, honestly, I do that. So what I do is that I try very hard, very, very hard to reach, to keep a foot in the community. more so than I do in places like, for example, this.
Well, I think your question, Esther, is a central question. How do you maintain integrity with personal ambition? I found that you fight a lot. You fight a whole lot. For example, I was really disturbed by the fact that the sentences that were given juveniles, when we had that real sort of blast of hideous sentences that were given young, mostly black men, it seemed to me. So I just decided I was going to launch a story. I became an editor, by the way, to deal with this. I decided we were going to launch a story that says, who are the young people who are sentenced? And is there a racial component to it? And what we found was obviously the case, was that young black and Hispanic men were the ones who were suffering most from this law. And we found instances in which whites who committed the same crimes were not. And about the question of crime victims and things like that, I just got so upset with every blonde missing person being a big story that we were supposed to cover, that I assigned a team of reporters to just do a story about missing black girls. So we went around the country and we said, who's missing and why aren't people advocating for them? These were controversial. We had to fight them. I fought a lot. I've been, yelled at, called a lot of names. But I think that if you have integrity, you have to have the strength to fight people. You have to stand up. And there are a lot of times when I've looked around and there's been no one behind me. And I kind of expect that sometimes. And I think that, your own career will go as it goes, and you will reach whatever it is that you're fated to reach. But if you leave it and you feel that you've lost that integrity, then your career is not really worth a damn. It's not really worth a damn at all.
Amen to that.
So, and the question of youth is really a really incredibly good question. This is something that has perplexed journalists for a long time, because I don't think that we know how to talk to youth. I think that most of the stories about youth are talking down to youth or using youth. They're not really interviewing people. We do school stories in New York without talking to any students. I don't understand how you do that. How do you know about how a school is without talking to any students? We talk to administrators, we talk to teachers, we talk to principals. We say some principal is spending a lot of money and not coming to the school. But what about the students? What do they feel about it? What do they feel about their education? And I think that these are things that we have a lot of work to do. I think that black youth, particularly youth African heritage, their images are maligned more than perhaps any other group in the whole society. And they have no voice. So we should give them a voice. We should talk to them. We should do stories about their achievements. We should do stories about their problems and their disappointments. And that's the only way you can do it. But it is something that journalism has always neglected. It's always been this great man sense of history. Whatever the president says, whatever the senator says, whatever the principal says, whatever de Blasio says. We see so many images of de Blasio's son, but I don't see many quotes from him. I don't, they talked about his decision, which school he wanted to go to, but what school did he want to go to and why? What did that school do for him? And these are the kinds of things I think connect more with youth, but that's a very good question. Thanks.
Well, I come at this as an educator. I sort of dabble with you journalists every now and again. But I'm in an institution, and they're called institutions for a reason. And so as, it's an institution. But for Esther's question, I think for me, as far as balancing this personal ambition, which for me is to get tenure and to have some job security so I can have
so you can say whatever you darn well please.
Yes, or a version thereof, right? Inside and outside the classroom. Dumi has tenure, which is great. Congratulations. But I will say, for me, it's keeping other people around me in a diverse setting. So keeping journalists around me who I love and respect, keeping other academics around me who were not only political scientists, but who were sociologists or historians or German professors or whatever it may be, so that if I do have, and having the courage to let them read some of my work, so that if I do sort of start to veer in the wrong direction, I have people that know me and respect me and can pull me back. And so one of my writing partners, or my writing partner is here. And we always say, if you're the baller in your set, you need a new set, right? And so all of us,
I love
it's like none of us are, right? And so we're all just constantly trying to climb. And as far as the youth is concerned, as an educator, what I've started doing, because I started writing op-eds relatively recently, which I feel is so late in life, but it's such a great way to have multiple voices, to be able to write a book, but also to write an op-ed, which is a total shift in gear. That's now mandatory assignments for every class I teach. So all of my students have to write op-eds. I'm teaching a presidency seminar, a race and ethnic politics seminar, intro to politics. Like, these are now going to be implemented in every single facet, just because they need to know how to write a research paper. They also need to know how to write a 3 to 5 page thought paper. They need to know how to write an op-ed. Can you make an argument? Can you have a hook? Can you get people interested and really have something that you're passionate about? And so I think for me, that's my contribution for the youth, just so that they can get used to doing this at a younger age, so that when they're older, if something really gets to them, the education system, gentrification, whatever it may be, and they're like, I'm writing the New York Times. Not thinking, and teaching them this power of privilege, right? Where it's like, well, your voice matters. You may not be at the fanciest place, or you may not have the most money, but you can write a letter to the editor, or you can write an op-ed, and hopefully someone can recognize and respect that. So I think that's the contribution that I'm working on within the institution.
And I would just say briefly, and then we're going to have to wrap up. My mom got hate mail during the civil rights movement because she was that woman always writing letters to the newspaper in the Midwestern town where she went to a predominantly white school. And I wrote a piece about ending apartheid when I was 16 years old that was in 17 magazine. And my mom, I didn't remember this, my mom was like, you didn't tell me you wrote it. One day the magazine came and you showed it to me. And I was like, well, look, I was learning at the School of Mom, So if you do teach, people understand that they have a voice, and that's been my whole life. And I would say, Esther, part of my journey now is I have been in business negotiations to do an independent podcast. And I've been pretty low profile in broadcast media compared to what I had been, but that's because I've been in business school. I'm getting my free MBA by learning from people who actually know how to raise money and do business. That's the evolution of my career. As I said to someone, all I ever wanted to do was tell stories, but in terms of telling the stories I wanted to tell, I had to learn business. And I never intended to, and I don't particularly like doing that part of my job, but it's what I have to do what I have to do. And what we have to do, as I try to teach my students, changes. Sometimes you're in an institution, different kinds of institutions. Sometimes you're a Ronin, you're like the samurai with the sword and, no shogun, and you're out there by yourself. And so, I think that all of us here have demonstrated we will do what we need to do to tell the stories we need to tell. And I know that many people in our audience feel the same way. So I want to we could go on all night, but we won't. The bar is still open for literally 10 minutes. If you want to refresh your drink, you can. But first, let's thank Raquel Cepeda, author of Bird of Paradise, How I Became Latina, Professor Lonnie Isabel, also a journalist, and Professor Christina Greer of Fordham, author of Black Ethnics. Thank you so much.